He was the king of late night, the man who tucked an entire nation into bed for 30 years. His smile was the gold standard of charm, and his wit was the pulse of America. But you have no idea what kind of void was hidden behind that perfectly tailored suit and his iconic golf swing. Why did the man worshipped by millions die in self-imposed exile, unreachable and untouchable? He made the whole world laugh, yet he spent decades drowning in a chilling, private silence. 4 marriages that turned into psychological battlefields. Sons who spent their lives begging for a spark of warmth, only to hit a wall of icy indifference. And a mother whose approval he chased until her very last breath, only to be met with a heart of stone. We all saw the glitz of The Tonight Show, but behind the curtain, there was only a haunting emptiness. Tonight, we're pulling back the veil on the life Johnny Carson fought so hard to hide. The brutal perfectionism that bordered on tyranny, the betrayals by his inner circle, and the tragic loss that shattered his soul. A story he never dared to tell on air. You thought you knew Johnny. You only knew the character. This is a story of absolute power, unparalleled fame, and the devastating price of being a legend. This is the truth about Johnny Carson, the man everyone watched, but nobody ever truly knew. Johnny Carson was born in 1925 in the small town of Corning, Iowa, and soon moved with his family to Norfolk, Nebraska. From the outside, it looked like a simple, hard-working Midwestern household. His father managed a local power company. His mother kept the home neat and orderly. There was food on the table, clean clothes, and a roof that never leaked. But stability is not the same as tenderness. In Johnny's early memories, affection was rare. His father, Homer Carson, believed deeply in discipline and self-reliance. He was not a cruel man, but he was a distant one. Praise came sparingly and only when it was earned. In that world, a child learned quickly not to ask for comfort. You were expected to be strong, quiet, and grateful. Emotional expression simply wasn't part of the family language. Johnny was a shy, observant boy, small for his age, always watching the adults around him to understand how to behave. He discovered early that humor could open doors that conversation could not. When he made his mother laugh, the room softened. When he joked with classmates, he felt included. Laughter became his first tool for belonging, a way to earn the warmth he didn't naturally receive at home. School offered an escape, but also new challenges. The Great Depression shaped Johnny's childhood just as much as his family did. Money was tight. Every purchase was measured. That atmosphere created pressure even in ordinary moments. Johnny delivered newspapers and took odd jobs, trying to contribute like a little adult. Responsibility arrived before carefree joy ever had the chance. At the age of 12, he became fascinated with magic tricks after receiving a mail-order magician's kit. On stage at local clubs, he transformed. The nervous boy disappeared, and a confident performer took his place. Yet that confidence lived only under the spotlight. Once the clapping stopped, Johnny returned to being a quiet kid in a house where feelings were still kept carefully folded away. The constant moving of the Carson family during those years added to his sense of rootlessness. Nebraska was home, but Johnny never felt entirely secure in it. He learned to adapt, to read people, to mirror the tone that was required. Friends later said he could charm anyone, but even as a boy, he held something back. He was learning to perform long before he had a national audience. His mother, Ruth Carson, loved him in her own restrained way. She encouraged his hobbies and protected him from harsh criticism, but she too was shaped by the era's stoic values. In their home, problems were handled with silence and endurance. Johnny absorbed that lesson deeply. Strength means not showing how much you hurt. World War II interrupted his teenage years. Johnny joined the Navy at 18, serving as a communications officer. The military reinforced everything his childhood had taught him: precision, timing, and control. Those skills would later make him a master of live television. But they also strengthened the emotional armor he had already begun to build. When the war ended, Johnny used the GI Bill to attend the University of Nebraska. He studied journalism and radio, discovering the craft that would define his life. Yet beneath those discoveries lay the same inner pattern. He could speak smoothly to strangers, but struggled to be open with people he loved. That contradiction did not begin with fame. It began in Nebraska. Childhood formed the foundation of the man Johnny Carson would become. Brilliant in front of a microphone, careful with his heart, always afraid that disorder or vulnerability could cost him respect. The boy learned to survive by reading the room and making it laugh. But survival tools have a way of following us into adulthood. Before Hollywood ever knew his name, Johnny Carson had already mastered the art of hiding emotion behind composure. And that quiet Midwestern upbringing, so orderly and so restrained, planted the seeds of the private storms that would one day stand in sharp contrast to the public smile America adored. The end of the war gave Johnny Carson something he had never truly possessed before: direction. At the University of Nebraska, he entered the world of radio broadcasting, hosting a small student program called The Squirrel's Nest. It was modest, even playful, but it revealed a talent that could no longer be ignored. Johnny had a natural ease with a microphone. His voice carried confidence. His humor felt intelligent rather than loud. Listeners leaned in because he sounded like someone worth trusting. College life appeared to suit him. He joined campus theater groups, performed magic shows for local audiences, and slowly refined the persona that would one day become famous nationwide. Yet, even during these hopeful years, the same emotional patterns remained. Johnny was charming, quick-witted, and endlessly professional, but deeply private. Friends recalled that he could light up any room, but rarely spoke about himself. The boy who learned silence at home had grown into a young man who used it as part of his craft. After graduating in 1949, Carson chased bigger opportunities, moving first to Omaha, then to Los Angeles, the city of endless dreams. Hollywood in the early 1950s was expanding rapidly. Television was becoming the new frontier, replacing radio as America's primary form of entertainment. Johnny sensed this shift instinctively. He began working at KNXT, a local CBS station, writing jokes, introducing shows, and learning the mechanics of live broadcast. It was here he discovered that timing wasn't just part of comedy, it was part of television survival. His first national break came with a game show called Earn Your Vacation. Soon after, he hosted Carson's Cellar, a low-budget local comedy program where he interviewed quirky characters and experimented freely. These early projects were not glamorous. The pay was small, the hours were brutal. But Johnny treated every assignment like it mattered. He arrived prepared, rehearsed lines carefully, and studied the rhythm of audience reactions. Colleagues saw devotion, producers saw potential. Yet his rise was far from immediate. Carson faced rejection, cancellation, and the constant insecurity of freelance work. Most young hosts tried to force their way onto screens. Johnny instead perfected patience. He listened more than he spoke. He learned to observe guests and adapt to their moods. That adaptability became his greatest strength. In 1954, he replaced Jack Parr as host of The Morning Show, proving he could handle pressure on a larger stage. America was slowly beginning to recognize his face. In 1955, Carson married his first wife, Jody Morrill Wolcott. The marriage looked ideal from a distance. Two young Midwesterners trying to build a life in California. They had 3 sons. Johnny worked relentlessly to provide, but his devotion to career already created distance at home. The firm hand of professionalism left little space for tenderness. Jody later admitted that living with Johnny felt like sharing a house with a performer who never fully left the stage. Professionally, the 1950s were a decade of learning. Carson wrote for Red Skelton, appeared on comedy panels, and filled in as substitute host for Jack Paar on Tonight Show. Those fill-in nights became crucial. Producers noticed how Johnny handled celebrities with calm respect. He didn't dominate interviews, he guided them. He made stars feel safe. And that is exactly what America needed. By 1962 came the moment that changed history. CBS offered him the permanent hosting position on Tonight Show. After years of struggling, Johnny Carson became the new king of late night.
But few understood that the throne he gained was built upon decades of small humiliations, sleepless nights, and a deep fear of failure he carried from childhood. Television was the perfect medium for Johnny Carson. It allowed him to control everything: the jokes, the timing, the distance between himself and the world. On screen, he appeared relaxed. Off screen, he remained guarded. That contradiction defined his entire early career. The public man was being born. The private man was quietly learning to disappear. The making of Johnny Carson was not a sudden miracle. It was a slow construction of voice, discipline, and emotional armor. And as the 1950s faded into the bright promise of the 1960s, Johnny stepped fully into the role he had been preparing for all his life. But preparation for fame does not prepare a man for happiness. By the early 1960s, Johnny Carson had finally reached what every entertainer dreams about: national recognition. When he officially became host of The Tonight Show in 1962, America welcomed him almost instantly. His calm Midwestern manner felt like a relief after the louder styles of earlier television. Carson did not shout for attention, he invited it. Viewers trusted him because he never seemed desperate. The show quickly turned into a nightly ritual. 5 evenings a week, Carson sat behind his desk like a friendly gatekeeper to Hollywood. Stars came nervous and left grateful. The audience laughed, applauded, and believed they were seeing the real man. But fame is a demanding landlord. It charges rent every day, and Johnny paid that rent with something invisible: his private life. Success changed the rules around him. Under his contract, Carson gained unusual power for a television host. He could choose guests, influence scripts, and even limit how many nights he worked. Professionally, it was a kingdom built exactly to his strengths. Personally, it became a cage. The more adored Johnny Carson became, the harder it was for him to relax anywhere outside the studio. His humor grew sharper and more confident. But confidence on screen created distance at home. Johnny was already married to Jody Morrill, raising 3 young sons. From the outside, they looked like the perfect American family. Yet inside their Los Angeles home, a different atmosphere ruled. Johnny worked late into the night, rehearsing monologues, rewriting jokes, studying audience letters. He treated television like a military mission. There was no alcohol, no careless parties, only relentless preparation. That discipline made him brilliant. It also made him absent. Carson soon moved the production to New York, and the entire family relocated. The transition was exciting for his career, but destabilizing for his marriage. Jody struggled to adapt to life in the public eye. Johnny struggled even more to adapt to emotional intimacy. He could make millions laugh, yet found it difficult to have simple conversations about feelings. Producers saw a master communicator. His wife saw a man slipping quietly away. The pressure of late-night television was enormous. Every episode demanded perfect timing. One mistake, one awkward guest could ruin the magic. Johnny feared that constantly. He inspected lighting, sound levels, even the way coffee was placed on his desk. Colleagues described him as warm but unreachable, friendly yet controlled. He was becoming more than a host. He was becoming an institution. And institutions rarely come home early for dinner. In 1963, tragedy struck his professional world when President Kennedy was assassinated. Carson handled the broadcast with calm respect. proving his maturity. America praised him for his dignity. Yet moments like that reinforced his belief that control over emotion was everything. He learned to separate the chaos of the world from the frame of television. But he could not separate television from his own soul.
As the years passed, Carson's fame only increased. The Ray-Ban sunglasses he wore became trends. His smile became the symbol of American evenings. Financially, he was secure for life. Emotionally, he was anything but. The look of effortless ease viewers adored was carefully manufactured each day. Rise brought him glory sweetness. It also brought him loneliness. The throne Johnny Carson finally claimed in 1962 made him powerful and nearly untouchable. But power does not guarantee peace. It guarantees only this: you must continue being perfect so the kingdom does not fall apart. By his late 30s, Johnny Carson had conquered Hollywood and New York alike. What no one knew was that the hardest battle of his life had only begun. Johnny Carson's second chapter of adulthood was defined by a pattern that would follow him for decades: complicated love. In 1963, just a year after taking over The Tonight Show, his first marriage to Jody Morrill Walcott began to crack beyond repair. They had been together since Johnny's college years, raising 3 sons: Christopher, Corey, and Richard. To neighbors, they looked stable and ordinary. To Johnny, ordinary intimacy felt strangely threatening. Carson was devoted to his career with an intensity few could match. The firm grip he kept over every aspect of his professional life slowly bled into his personal relationships. He was jealous, restless, often emotionally unavailable. His wife loved the witty, confident man she saw on television. But living with Johnny Carson was not the same as watching him. Divorce came quietly in 1972 after years of tension. The public barely noticed. Johnny did. Instead of retreating, Carson married Joanne Copeland in 1963, his second wife and another attempt at stability. Joanne was sophisticated, intelligent, and comfortable in Hollywood circles. But once again, Johnny treated marriage like a performance contract. He could be generous and polite, yet remain distant at home.
Approval was easy to give to strangers, hard to give to a spouse. Joanne later confided to friends that Johnny was kind but closed, a man who preferred jokes to real discussions. The cycle repeated almost mechanically. In 1972, Carson married his third wife, model Joanna Holland. This marriage was fiery, passionate, and turbulent. They lived in New York and Malibu, surrounded by luxury, high-performance cars, glamorous homes, and endless applause. But turbulence on screen followed Johnny home more powerfully than ever. Alcohol became a subtle but persistent presence. Arguments grew sharper. Long silences followed. Joanna Holland later described the marriage as exhausting, relentless, full of love that never found a safe place to land. Their divorce in 1985 became one of the most expensive in Hollywood history, reportedly costing Johnny over $20 million. Money left him. Peace did not arrive. That same year, he married his fourth wife, Alexis Moss. Alexis was younger, calmer, and seemed to understand Johnny's need for solitude. The final union appeared steadier, but even here, Carson kept his distance. He avoided social media and careless interviews. He slept little, trained himself to remain the perfect host. Friends said he was happiest when working. Perhaps that was the problem. Johnny Carson's relationships never collapsed because he was evil or unlovable. They collapsed because he never truly learned how to be emotionally present. Each marriage became both a cure and an addiction. The more he succeeded, the emptier he often felt. Within that emptiness came the deepest tragedy of all. In 1991, his son Richard died in a car accident. The nation mourned softly. Johnny mourned in silence, admitting almost nothing publicly. Yet a source close to the family revealed he was shattered beyond words. Tragedy was entering the story in ways no script could control. Love for Johnny Carson was always a complicated equation. Fame, discipline, jealousy, alcohol, silence. And when all those elements mixed together, no relationship could survive intact. The man who spent his life talking to America could barely talk to his own heart. And to understand why Johnny Carson became increasingly lonely, even amid applause, we have to return to that cold, fundamental lesson he learned as a boy. You can entertain everyone. You cannot hold everyone close. By the 1970s, Johnny Carson was no longer simply a television host. He had become the gravitational center of American entertainment. But while his professional world appeared perfectly aligned, his inner life was increasingly unstable. The same traits that made him brilliant on air, emotional control, sharp observation, and distance, were quietly working against him. Behind the scenes of The Tonight Show, Carson demanded absolute precision. Scripts were rewritten until they felt effortless. Camera angles were adjusted to his liking. Sound and lighting were never approximate, only exact. Colleagues respected him deeply, yet many admitted they feared disappointing him. Johnny rarely raised his voice, but his silences could be intimidating. A single look from Carson was enough to end a conversation. That atmosphere produced legendary television. It also revealed a legendary contradiction. Alcohol, which had first entered his life as a social companion, was becoming something more complex. Johnny enjoyed drinking with friends after tapings, a way to decompress from the pressure of nightly performance. But decompression can slowly turn into dependency. Stories circulated about nights when Johnny drank too much, became melancholic, or withdrew completely into himself. America never saw that side. His wives did. The humor that flowed so naturally on screen often vanished at home. Carson's marriage to Joanna Holland had already ended in emotional exhaustion. His union with Joanna Holland, though passionate, had followed the same turbulent path as earlier relationships. Each divorce felt to Johnny like another personal failure, yet he never allowed those failures to change his habits. He preferred to handle pain the way he always had, alone. Carson's childhood had planted deep insecurities. Even at the height of his success, he remained afraid of chaos, afraid of losing relevance, afraid that one misstep could dethrone him. Those fears manifested in perfectionism, mood swings, and emotional distance. Friends described him as generous and kind, yet fundamentally guarded. A man who could connect with strangers, but struggled to stay open with people he loved. His sons tried to reach him, but Johnny Carson was difficult to access, even for family. Professionally, Johnny won multiple Emmy Awards, hosted the Oscars, and became the highest-paid man on television. But every triumph seemed only to deepen his inner tension. The private storms grew larger beneath the surface. Johnny had built his life around the art of performance. He had never learned how to build one around peace. Then came 1991, the year the armor finally cracked. When his son Richard died in that tragic hillside car accident, Johnny Carson was devastated in ways he never publicly admitted. He took time off from the show, returned somber and thinner, carrying a grief he could not transform into jokes. For the first time, America sensed something was wrong. But sensing is not the same as knowing. This chapter shows the emotional turning point of Johnny's life. A man forced to face loss without a script, without a desk, without the comforting distance of a studio audience. And from that moment forward, Johnny Carson would never be quite the same. The cycle of inner demons had finally met a tragedy too real to ignore. For 30 years, Johnny Carson ended American nights with laughter. But late-night royalty lived under late-night pressure. The 1980s brought Johnny Carson into an era when television competition intensified.
New hosts emerged. Cable channels expanded.
The media grew louder and more intrusive. And Johnny, always private, felt increasingly cornered. On camera, he remained the ultimate professional. Warm smile, gentle humor, perfect timing. Off camera, his temper sometimes flared in unexpected ways. Producers revealed he disliked inefficiency, sloppy preparation, or guests who disrupted the rhythm. Chaos on set made him physically uncomfortable. Johnny treated every episode like a carefully balanced operation, but his public image was growing harder to maintain. Tabloids in the 1980s became obsessed with Carson's personal life. His expensive divorce from Joanna Holland was still fresh in public memory. Stories spread about his drinking habits and episodes of melancholy. Johnny rarely responded. He avoided interviews, believing that speaking publicly about private matters only invited more chaos. Silence became his shield. Yet shields can isolate a man from his own world. Retirement from the show in 1992 was approaching, and Johnny Carson feared it deeply. Television had been his identity for decades. Who would Johnny be without applause? Friends noticed he grew more reflective, sometimes sadder, carrying the fear of becoming irrelevant. Hollywood is unforgiving with age, especially for men whose careers depend on charm. Charm does not age easily. His fourth wife, Alexis Moss, provided calm stability, but even here, Johnny kept emotional distance. He preferred solitude, long walks on Malibu beaches, quiet evenings at home. The man who once hosted hundreds of celebrities now avoided most of them. Fame had given him everything he asked for, except closeness. The 1991 loss of his son Richard haunted Johnny Carson profoundly. But instead of sharing that grief, Johnny buried himself in work, vintage cars, and quiet rituals. He sent friends the famous Carson cake each Christmas, a small gesture of warmth in a life otherwise disciplined almost to the monastic level. No drugs, no scandals, only control.
Yet, critics began to view his later substitute projects as formulaic or lacking evolution. Audiences still loved him, but Johnny wondered if they loved the man or only the memory of him. The media called him the last gentleman of television. Gentlemen, however, can be lonely kings. This chapter explores the split between admiration and scrutiny in Johnny Carson's later public years. A man celebrated by millions, yet increasingly cautious and withdrawn from the world he once seemed to command. And as the bright 1980s faded into the quieter 1990s, Johnny Carson was slowly learning the most painful truth about fame. It can make you immortal. It can also leave you entirely alone. For decades, Johnny Carson mastered the delicate art of public composure. He had interviewed presidents, legends of cinema, and the brightest stars in the world without ever losing control of a moment. But there were parts of his life that even Johnny Carson's legendary discipline could not keep neatly contained. Real tragedies, the kind that do not dissolve when the cameras cut to commercial. The most devastating of those moments arrived in June of 1991. His son, Richard Wolcott Carson, died in a car accident in California, plunging off a steep embankment while taking photographs in the hills. To the nation, it was a brief news headline, one sad story among many. But to Johnny, it was an earthquake inside his soul. Friends said he was crushed, unable to speak about it for weeks. Yet, when he finally returned to television, he did exactly what he always did. He hid it. Viewers noticed something different. Johnny looked thinner, older, more fragile. His humor remained, but it carried a softer, almost melancholic edge.
On the show, he mentioned the loss only once, thanking people for their kindness before quickly moving forward. That was Johnny's way. Never dwell, never reveal too much. But behind closed doors, he struggled profoundly, confronting a grief that had no stage to transform upon.
Carson had already endured another loss years earlier when his mother passed away. He had quietly cared for her, but spoke little about it. Emotional vulnerability felt to Johnny like losing control, and control was the foundation of his identity. Yet, even beyond family tragedies, Johnny carried other inner battles. He had episodes of depression that few knew about. He feared aging deeply, terrified that one day he would no longer be quick enough, charming enough, relevant enough. Television had turned him into an immortal icon, but immortality is only an illusion provided by reruns and memories. Off-air, Johnny's darker moods sometimes surfaced. Long silences at dinner tables, sudden irritations over small disruptions, drinking as a way to compress tension. He was not an abusive man, but he was often an emotionally exhausted one. His fourth wife, Alexis Moss, later confided that Johnny was kind and generous, yet fundamentally guarded, someone who preferred solitude to heavy emotional conversations, a man who joked with everyone and cried almost with no one. Former colleagues recalled that after tapings, Johnny sometimes sat alone in his dressing room, staring quietly at a television monitor long after the audience had gone home. Those moments revealed something essential. The laughter he provided was real, but it was also his escape route from pain. Tragedy for Johnny Carson was not theatrical. It was silent and inward. Perhaps that is why America found it so difficult to truly understand him. He made the world laugh even when his own heart was breaking. He hosted the Oscars, appeared on magazine covers, and remained the perfect professional. But perfection has a cost, and the cost was a lifetime of compressed sorrow. This chapter stands as the emotional core of the film. Johnny Carson confronting losses too real to transform into humor, revealing a man who carried tragedies privately rather than publicly.
And as the 1990s approached their end, Johnny Carson was slowly learning something even harder than grief. He was learning how to live without a desk and microphone to hide behind. In 1992, Johnny Carson walked away from The Tonight Show, ending one of the longest reigns in television history. For 30 years, he had been the comforting voice that ended America's days, and suddenly, the ritual stopped. The final broadcast in May of that year was emotional and dignified, filled with applause and tears from the crew. But once again, Johnny kept his composure. Retirement was supposed to bring peace. Johnny moved permanently to Malibu, California, into a beautiful ocean view home where everything was orderly and quiet. He spent time sailing, playing tennis, enjoying vintage cars, and taking long walks along the beach. Yet the quiet began to feel heavy. Friends noticed he struggled with identity. For decades, Johnny Carson had not merely hosted a show, he had become the show. Without guests and monologues, he felt strangely unanchored. Offers for new television projects arrived, but Johnny refused almost all of them. He avoided interviews, talk shows, and public appearances. The man who once spoke effortlessly to millions now preferred solitude and silence. Approval no longer mattered, perhaps because there was no audience left to approve. The death of his son Richard continued haunting Johnny Carson throughout the 1990s. Even in luxury homes filled with sunlight, grief whispered at him. But Johnny rarely spoke about it. Instead, he sent handwritten letters to charities, donated millions anonymously, and maintained a disciplined lifestyle. No alcohol publicly, no social media, only control. His final years were marked by increasing health struggles. Johnny underwent heart surgery in 1999 and emphysema slowly weakened him. But even as his body grew frailer, Johnny Carson refused to appear vulnerable. He declined requests to return for anniversary specials of the show, believing that late-night television belonged to the young. He did not want to be remembered as an aging king, only as the perfect one. Retirement for Johnny Carson was not filled with grand scandals or loud confessions. It was filled instead with a quiet emptiness, a man learning to live without the structure that had protected him since youth. Television had once been his salvation. Now silence was becoming his companion. In 2005, Johnny Carson passed away at the age of 79 in Los Angeles, California. The nation mourned deeply, remembering the laughter and dignity he had given them for decades. But behind that mourning remained the final contradiction. Johnny Carson had been wholly loved by America, yet lived much of his life feeling profoundly alone. This chapter explores Johnny's late-life transition, a man retiring into Malibu luxury while confronting the emptiness of a world without applause, health struggles, and the lasting grief over his son. And as the legacy of Johnny Carson faded into reruns and memories, America was left with one final, heartbreaking realization. The king of late-night laughter had carried a lifetime of sorrow he never allowed them to see. The final act of Johnny Carson's life unfolded far from the desk that had defined him. After stepping down from The Tonight Show in 1992, he disappeared almost completely from the world he once seemed to command. No farewell tours, no victory laps, just a quiet retreat to Malibu, where the ocean became his audience and the gulls replaced applause. At first, retirement looked gentle on him. Johnny spent his days sailing his yacht along the California coast, playing tennis at his private court, and reading newspapers on a sunlit terrace. He donated millions to charities, often anonymously, supporting young performers and educational programs. Friends said he was generous in ways the public never imagined. But generosity does not erase solitude. It only makes it more comfortable. Without the nightly rhythm of television, Johnny Carson felt unanchored. For 30 years, he had lived inside schedules, monologues, and guest lists. Now the days stretched long and unstructured. Offers to return for specials arrived regularly. Networks begged him to host new programs or appear as a legendary guest. Johnny refused almost all of them. He didn't want to watch himself grow older on camera. He wanted to remain frozen in memory, perfect and controlled, exactly as America remembered him. But time does not negotiate. In 1999, Carson underwent quadruple bypass heart surgery, a reminder that even kings have fragile bodies. Emphysema, likely worsened by years of smoking and occasional drinking, slowly weakened him through the early 2000s. Yet Johnny treated illness the way he had always treated pressure, with quiet endurance. He avoided hospitals when possible, disliked being fussed over, and rarely complained. His famous voice, once so steady and playful, grew thinner. Phone calls became shorter, visits from friends fewer. He did not want pity, perhaps because he feared it more than pain. Johnny's fourth wife, Alexis Moss, remained his calm companion during those final years. Alexis understood his need for privacy, shielding him from reporters and unwanted attention. Together, they lived simply within luxury. Quiet dinners, small routines, long silences that no longer felt awkward to her. But even Alexis Moss admitted that Johnny was difficult to reach emotionally. He could be kind, thoughtful, even humorous, yet kept the deepest parts of himself carefully locked away. His surviving sons, Corey and Christopher, tried to maintain closeness with their father. They visited him in Malibu, shared holidays, and protected his legacy. But Johnny Carson had never been an openly expressive parent. The bond existed, yet it was restrained, shaped by decades of distance. Johnny loved them.
He simply did not know how to show it in big, easy gestures. The public man had swallowed the private one long ago. In 2003, Carson made one rare appearance at the Kennedy Center Honors, sitting in the audience rather than on stage. Viewers across America hoped it signaled a return. It did not. Johnny preferred to stay invisible, believing perhaps that legends should exit quietly. His final years were filled instead with handwritten letters, philanthropic acts, and a disciplined lifestyle that bordered on the monastic. No social media, no interviews, only control. By 2004, his health declined rapidly. Friends said Johnny became reflective, sometimes melancholic, carrying regrets he never spoke aloud. The loss of his son Richard remained the deepest wound, a tragedy that haunted him until the very end. But Johnny Carson faced it silently, the way he had faced almost everything in life, alone inside composure. On January 23, 2005, Johnny Carson passed away at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. America mourned the loss of a television icon whose calm smile had guided them for decades. Networks ran tributes. Old clips resurfaced. Viewers laughed again at jokes they already knew by heart. But the final years of Johnny Carson reveal something deeper than nostalgia. They reveal a man who spent his life being seen by millions, yet slowly became comfortable only when no one was looking. The king of late-night laughter exited the stage the way he always insisted, quietly, with dignity, and with a silence that left the world wishing they had known him just a little more closely. Perhaps that is the final tragedy of Johnny Carson. He gave America perfect evenings, but never learned how to give himself peace within them. For nearly half a century, Johnny Carson was the final voice many Americans heard before sleep. His calm humor and steady presence shaped what late-night television would forever become. To viewers, he seemed unbreakable. The man who could rescue any awkward moment with a perfect joke and make every guest feel important. His legacy in American culture is monumental. Generations of hosts, from David Letterman to Jay Leno and Conan O'Brien, built their careers on the foundation Johnny created. But foundations can be heavy to live with. Carson's career left behind more than Emmy Awards and historic broadcasts. It left a template for how interviews should feel: respectful, playful, patient. He turned conversation into an art form. Yet the private story of Johnny Carson is far more complicated than the public remembers. Behind the radiant smiles on magazine covers stood a man who never fully escaped the emotional patterns of his childhood. He entertained the nation. He carried his pain alone. In the years after his retirement, America tried to pull Johnny back into the spotlight. They wanted more of him, more interviews, more appearances, more reassurance that the king was still there. Johnny refused. Perhaps because he understood something few icons admit. People love the image more easily than the human being behind it. And Johnny Carson was tired of being an image. His philanthropy, mostly unseen by the public, became one of the purest parts of his later life. He donated over $150 million to the Johnny Carson Foundation, supporting education and young artists. That generosity proved he was kind and thoughtful beyond the jokes. But even those closest to him admitted that Johnny remained fundamentally guarded. Emotional closeness never came easily. Relationships in his life were often fragmented by jealousy, perfectionism, and the weight of fame. The loss of his son Richard never healed, and perhaps it was never meant to. Johnny Carson's final contradiction lives on. A man deeply woven into American memories, yet absent from most modern stories because he chose privacy over prolonged exposure. His quiet lifestyle in Malibu symbolized that choice. Sailing boats, reading papers, avoiding interviews. The nation remembered him as the last true gentleman of television. But gentlemen can be lonely kings. Carson's passing in 2005 produced an outpouring of tributes across the United States. Viewers wrote letters, networks replayed monologues. Old Hollywood friends recalled how Johnny could make anyone laugh. Yet beneath all that gratitude lingered an uncomfortable truth. The man America adored was never fully known, even by America itself. Legacy is what remains after the noise fades. And what remains from Johnny Carson is both beautiful and sad. He created a form of television that still comforts millions of retirees today. His humor remains easy to hear and gentle on the heart. But his personal story serves as a reminder that the brightest entertainers often carry the deepest silences. Johnny Carson's life was not merely the journey of a television star. It was the quiet tragedy of a man who learned to survive through control and spent decades trying to protect himself from chaos, scrutiny, and vulnerability. His story ends as it began, with composure. But now the audience finally understands what they could not for decades. Behind the perfect timing and warm desk-side smiles lived a man who gave America laughter as a gift each night, while carrying a lifetime of sorrow almost entirely alone. To understand Johnny Carson fully is to feel both gratitude and grief, and perhaps to shed a quiet tear for the king who never allowed himself to cry on stage.